Now, the frontline situation. Joining us is Pavlo Lakiychuk, Military Security Programs Head at the Center for Global Studies, Strategic Action. He joins us live. Hello, Pavel.
Hello, glory to Ukraine.
Good afternoon. Glory to the heroes.
Pavel, how do you assess the situation today? Where is the most critical situation right now? If we look at the assault actions of Russian troops, then in terms of numbers, of course, the Pokrovsk direction remains the main one. However, as noted by the General Staff, overall, the number of attacks by Russian military forces has decreased. How do you assess this?
It's difficult for the Russians as well. That's why the situation on the battlefield is changing. After prolonged and intense months-long fighting for Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad, the Russians have practically taken Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad. They need to advance northward. What was the purpose of all these battles? Their goal was to get behind our group's lines. But now, they no longer have the means to get behind the Ukrainian armed forces grouping in Donbas. Moreover, they have to redeploy some of their forces to other directions because things are just as intense in the south. The Ukrainian Defense Forces, they are carrying out counterattacks north of Hulyapol. Consequently, the Russians are forced to redeploy and relocate their strategic military reserves and resources there from the Donbas region. This clearly demonstrates which specific areas are currently critical and high-pressure zones for them. On the other hand, the ongoing counterattacks launched by Ukrainian forces in the Zaporizhia direction, located in the southeastern region of the Zaporizhia sector, they simply do not reach the Donbas. Secondary, northern northwestern Donbas. These are not merely simple attempts to strategically encircle and completely cut off the entire group of forces, but they are instead being replaced by consistent attempts at frontal pressure and a steady method of advancing forward, all along the active front line. And here the absolutely critical strategic point becomes Kostiantynivka, which they are also currently attempting to encircle. But this is a tactical encirclement from three different sides. Right now, Kostiantynivka is probably the most intense and volatile hotspot of fighting along the entire front line. Well, of course, this certainly does not necessarily mean that. Well, it's even hard to calculate the ratio there. It's tough there, and it's tough here too. Walk the field hard, Konstantinov Kaliman. At this moment, the Russian forces are trying to force their way deep into the Sumy region in the north and partly into the Kharkiv region, to wedge themselves into our territory and break through our sovereign border. But we must ask ourselves for what reason? In an effort to prevent us from maneuvering our resources, overextending our defense forces. This suggests that currently there are not enough resources to sustain them. And it appears that they will be regrouping themselves while they are obviously accumulating more resources for the future. To call this a lull, a quiet spring lull, even the tongue doesn't turn to say it, yes. But it is obvious that in the spring, something like this could have started. We could witness a significant and dangerous new wave of assaults, especially if the hostile occupying forces find additional reserves to expand the scale and intensity of their ongoing attacks.
Pavel, well, overall, how would you assess the Russian army's ability to actually try to accumulate the necessary resources and personnel, as you mentioned, reserves, since they are constantly talking about a spring offensive again? Well, in principle, I'd like to point out or just remind our viewers who may have forgotten that essentially every year we talk about spring, summer, winter, and so on, and about the enemy's plans to launch an offensive. But, as I like to repeat, having the desire and having the capability are two completely different things. So how would you assess the statements and information we're receiving about preparations for a new large-scale offensive? This offensive that's supposedly planned for the spring?
I won't tie it specifically to the seasons.
Most likely.
The Russians. They accumulate their resources, meticulously prepare for an offensive operation. determine the exact timing, decide how many resources to allocate for each phase, and then finally throw everything they have into battle. And now, we are seeing that the initial phase, where resources are planned out for a duration of 3 to 4 months, is effectively being erased today. They can throw in additional reserves or perhaps even more ammunition. These moments represent the most intense and demanding periods of enemy activity. But then it turns out that the resources intended for subsequent operations have already been used up. Take Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad, for example, right? And now there's nowhere to get more. So, the intensity of combat operations decreases somewhat. High-ranking Russian military generals and the general staff are reportedly heading to the Kremlin to ask Putin for additional resources. At these annual reporting and election meetings of the Ministry of Defense, and at every Defense Ministry board meeting, he always says, "You're doing well, of course, but I won't give you any more resources. You must manage effectively with the assets you have." So that is essentially the fundamental way in which this wave-like curve oscillates and extends forward, maintaining its repetitive pattern as it steadily progresses.
And do you agree with the conclusions of the analysts from the Institute for the Study of War? That the Kremlin will have to abandon its plan for a spring-summer offensive. I'll even quote here that Ukrainian forces have successfully are counterattacking not only in the Alexandrovsk and Gulyapol directions, but also in the western part of the Zaporizhzhia region. And these counterattacks have a tactical, operational, and strategic impact that could disrupt Russia's planned offensive campaign in the spring and summer of this year. How do you assess such possibilities? And let's say, what specific red flags, so to speak, will we see that indicate Russia has already exhausted its momentum and is finally stopping its offensive operations?
When we look closely at the various movements in the Russian rear areas and supply lines, it appears they are now trying to form a newly organized grouping of forces to continue and expand their current offensive operations. The fundamental question remains that, depending on the military resources they manage to accumulate each time, and on the activity of the local defense forces on the ground, the scale of this offensive is subject to change. If just about a month ago it was possible to assess and determine where they might launch their attack from, either coming from the south or from the east in Donbass, effectively confirming the statements made by Putin that he supposedly desperately needs Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, whether he would stop there or instead shift the direction of the main strike to the south, thereby contradicting his previous claims. This confirms that Putin will push wherever he possibly can, or they will begin their strategic advancement from two different directions at the same time. And now it is certainly not out of the question that, given the limited nature of their resources, the Russians may significantly reduce the overall width of the active offensive front. They might even switch to a defensive posture there. Well, most likely, they will still try to continue the offensive on a narrower front. We previously talked about how Russia's strategic advantage lies in the fact that they have a vast amount of manpower and a lot of material resources compared to the Ukrainian defense forces. That is why they can continually overextend our defenses, while at the same time having the ability to concentrate their forces and resources in the direction of the main strike. But now the width of the front, the active front, will be narrowing. Or, on the contrary, there might not be a primary strategic direction of attack at all. Essentially, in their view, they might say, well, we won't actually be able to capture or seize those specific areas of Ukraine that they had declared, and instead they'll just terrorize. By making numerous small cuts all along the extensive front line across the entire length of the border and throughout the entire line of contact stretching from Chernihiv all the way down to Kherson.
Tell me, in your opinion, how significant and noticeable is the impact of the Ukrainian campaign of strikes on the enemy's rear areas at this point in time? We're talking about logistics centers, warehouses, and oil and military infrastructure. Even recalling that story with Bryansk, with the company Kremlin Elektronika, which was essentially involved in producing the much-needed electronics used in the Russian Federation's arms industry, including in missile programs. How should we? Try, from what position should we approach this in order to understand how painful these strikes are for the Russian Federation?
Well, I would break this down, divided into two components and not by their range, but by precise targeting.
Although that's an important factor, you have to agree. Yes.
I agree. The first group of targets are those that directly support the Russian military machine. These are strategic supply depots, airfields, ammunition storage facilities, fuel and lubricants depots, and industrial manufacturing plants that directly produce shells, munitions, missiles, and so on. All of these targets are perfectly clear. The Russians have a comprehensive operational schedule and a detailed logistical chart. The actual delivery of the corresponding munitions, roughly speaking, all the way from the original manufacturing facility directly to a specific frontline battalion. And when a significant military arsenal is taken out here, or perhaps an area with storage depots, in the same way trucks from the brigade come to the Shaheds to pick up their ammunition supplies, they are told, you have no ammunition, you're free to go, there won't be any for a week, wait until it's brought from the Far East. This is a direct correlation. A strike produces results on the battlefield almost instantly. There are key targets of a strategic military economic nature that must be addressed. These are the primary targets that generate the massive stream of bloody oil dollars, which directly fund and sustain this aggressive Russian war machine. While they are not immediately or directly linked to today's active battlefield, they guarantee its continued operation in the future, which essentially signifies that Russian oil is far more than just gasoline, diesel, and rocket fuel. This is exactly the continuous financial flow of those vital petrodollars. And when a precision strike hits a critical oil refinery, the Russians are forced to immediately repair it. And in the meantime, it stops working entirely. And instead of spending that vital money on the army or on those expensive mercenaries who are being recruited into the Russian army, every day, the enterprise simply doesn't generate any money at all. Instead, significant funds are sucked out, vacuumed in the opposite direction to cover the costs.